In Wellington with you all. As you know, I have three key priorities for New Zealand, and that is to rebuild the economy, restore law and order, and deliver better public services. I spent the last week in Southeast Asia with the New Zealand business delegation, strengthening relationships in the region as part of our wider plan to rebuild the economy. And today, we're straight back into work and turning our attention to that second priority of restoring law and order. I'm joined today by Associate Justice Minister Nicole McKee to announce details of our plan to bring back three strikes legislation. We are putting victims and public safety back at the centre of the justice system and ensuring that there are appropriate consequences for offending. We've already undertaken a number of actions aimed firmly at making our communities safer. We're tackling the fear and intimidation caused by gangs to our communities by banning gang insignia from public places. We're making it more difficult for gang members to communicate and to associate, and we're giving more weight to gang membership in sentencing. We are increasing police powers to search gang members and serious offenders for firearms, and we have ended taxpayer funding for Section 27 reports. We've also recently announced 9 ambitious government targets to help improve the lives of Kiwis, 2 of which are focused on crime. In the next 5 years, we want less violent crime, with 20,000 fewer people the victims of assaults, robberies and sexual assaults by 2029. We also want to see reduced child and youth offending, with a 15% reduction in the number of children and young people with serious, persistent offending behaviour. Violent crime hurts our people and it hurts our communities. It especially affects Māori and those already experiencing disadvantage, including across the generations. Now we are turning our attention to the harm done by repeat, serious offenders. Criminals need to know that their actions will not be tolerated by this government, and we are determined to keep our communities safe. We want serious, repeat offenders off the streets. And that's why we are restoring three strikes legislation with improvements to make sure that it focuses on the serious offenders the public are rightly concerned about. Now I'm going to hand over to Nicole McKee to take you through the details of the new and improved three strikes regime. Nicole.
Thank you, Prime Minister. New Zealanders are rightly concerned about violence and crime in our country. We've made it really clear to New Zealanders that we are committed to addressing gang crime, to enforcing consequences on criminals, and to keep our communities safe. Repeat offending does repeated harm to victims and communities. The return of three strikes recognises this harm, and that is why today we are announcing our plans to introduce a revised three strikes law. These plans have been clearly flagged in our coalition agreement. By committing to introducing this law, we are signalling that serious violent offending is unacceptable and that there will be hefty consequences for those crimes. Like the previous law, there will be a three-stage regime of increasingly tougher penalties for those who ignore warnings and continue to offend. While the new regime will cover the same serious, violent and sexual offences as the previous law, we are also going to add the strangulation and suffocation offence. Serious repeat offenders will face no parole for their second strike, and for their third strike they can expect the maximum sentence, also without parole. We acknowledge some lessons from the previous law and have made some changes to help determine that it applies only to serious repeat offenders. The previous three strikes legislation applied on conviction, regardless of the sentence length, or whether the offence was minor or serious. We intend to change this so the new regime only applies to sentences of more than 24 months. This means that only individuals who have committed an offence serious enough to warrant a more than 24-month sentence from the list of qualifying offences will receive a strike warning and face the increased penalties under the new three strikes regime. The intention is to limit the new three strikes regime to serious repeat offenders without capturing the low-level offending. We intend to provide narrow exceptions to allow judicial discretion not to impose the mandatory sentence or parole requirements when it would be manifestly unjust to do so. The previous legislation had only very limited exceptions to the mandatory requirements. We are also introducing guiding principles to clarify how this exception will apply and make sure it is applied in line with Parliament's intent. Under the previous legislation, there was limited incentive for an offender to plead guilty at a third strike or for a second or third strike murder offence because the mandatory penalty applied in full regardless. Under the new regime, there will be a limited benefit for guilty pleas, and if it's taken up, this will mean that victims do not have to go through a trial. Finally, the new regime will change the way that people who commit murder at second or third strike are sentenced, with offenders receiving appropriately lengthy non-parole periods. Reinstating a three strikes regime is an important part of the Coalition Government's response to serious crime. I expect to take a draft bill and paper to Cabinet by the end of June and introduce the bill soon after that. I will recommend that the bill come into effect 6 months after it is passed to allow enough time for the implementations of things like changes to IT systems and training. Our aim is to strike a balance between avoiding unjust outcomes and making sure that there are tougher consequences for serious repeat offenders. And I am confident that the new three strikes legislation will have all of these elements in place. Thank you, and I'll now hand back to the Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Minister McKee. As you have heard, this government is determined to put public safety back at the heart of the criminal justice system. We believe that our new three strikes regime strikes the right balance and, together with other measures that we've taken, will continue to help restore law and order in New Zealand. With that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Are these changes a recognition that the previous three strikes law had major issues?
Well, as you can see, as Nicole quite rightly pointed out, we've made some adjustments based off what we had learned from the previous legislation. But again, what is important here is that we want serious criminals, offenders, sexual offenders taken off the streets, and that's very, very deliberate.
The Ministry of Justice also previously found that three strikes did little to reduce serious criminal offending. How is this going to change that?
Well, what I just say to you, if this piece of legislation actually saves one person from the pain and suffering caused by violent sexual criminal activity, that's a good thing.
So you don't think this is just tough on crime posturing?
No, this is about making sure, even as I said to you, even if it just saves one person from going through all that pain, harm, distress caused by some individual, a violent offender, causing them that grief, that is well worth it. And I make no apologies about
Why
that.
are you announcing this now when the draft bill hasn't even gone to Cabinet yet?
I'll let Nicole.
Well, it's part of our second tranche of commitment in our 100 days is that I would take advice to Cabinet. That advice has been taken. We are announcing that we will be introducing a bill. It is imminent, and we are sticking to our plans to make New Zealand a safer place for our communities.
But if the draft bill hasn't gone to Cabinet yet, when it goes to Cabinet, is it possible that further changes might be made, that the scheme that you've announced today might be different to the one that actually comes into
Well, what we've committed to under our 36-point action plan, which we announced for the Q2, is to say, look, we're going to take a decision on it, which we've done that in Cabinet, where that's what we're announcing here today. But actually, we're also going to introduce legislation to the House by the end of that quarter as well. Then we'll run through a process, which will be through that select committee process from there.
Yeah, my question though is what you've announced today, the scheme you've announced today, when it goes to Cabinet by the end of June, is it possible that what you've announced today might change by the time that it comes into effect, once Cabinet's considered it?
No, because
Yes,
it's when it gets introduced to the House. We already have approval by Cabinet for the regime that we want to place. We're now going to put it into legislation and have it introduced.
Have officials given you any estimates of the number of additional?
Officials
given you any estimate of the number of additional prisoners this will lead to?
From memory, it's about up to 90 extra prisoners and up to probably about $11 million of cost over the period.
So 90 extra over the 4-year forecast?
It's about 90 people at the maximum estimated every year over the next 10 years at a cost of between $4 to $11 million.
Given a longer term, I understand there's a 50-year figure. It's possible to model a 50-year, like quite a long-term figure over the course of the regime?
No, I think that's getting a bit counterproductive at that point in time. What I'd say to you is it's very important for us to make sure we put the legislation in place, make sure we actually turn around violent crime, which has been up over 30%. And as I said, frankly, if it saves one person from going through the pain and suffering caused by a violent criminal or violent sexual offender, that's a good thing.
People a year over 10 years, it's 900 people?
That's at the
quite a lot.
higher estimate. It's actually been regarded as between about 45 to 90 people per year over the next 10 years. It's hard to estimate because we are changing and improving the regime. So, that's the best estimates that we can give.
Does this not also,
Sorry.
does this not also run the risk of creating sort of lengthy court battles of people sort of appealing their sentences?
I don't
Like
believe
last
so.
time?
No, I don't believe so, because we're having that carve-out of 24 months. So under the new regime, it means that anybody that is sentenced to over 24 months for one of those qualifying offences will be eligible for a strike. Those lower-level offences, where they're sentenced to 24 months or less, will not be eligible for a strike, even though they're under the qualifying offences.
Can you elaborate on the
And what
kind of
judges-
cases that...
Sorry, just go to Brighton and we'll come to you.
And
Yeah.
judges last time were obviously able to get around this by using the manifestly unjust exception. So can you just unpack how that won't happen this time?
Yes, by being able to give some guiding principles to judges on what Parliament's intent is. They never had the guiding principles in the past, so we're going to give them guiding principles. We've talked about the 24 months where they can address the lower level offending, and we think by looking at case law, the Ministry of Justice has done a fantastic job of being able to pull together a revised and improved three strikes regime.
Was the decision to extend it out to 24 months, to kind of put that as the lower limit, is that because there were some people who were getting caught up in the three strikes under the last regime that shouldn't have?
Well, we look at some of those cases that occurred under the previous regime and definitely noted that we needed to have improvement. Some cases came to be highlighted, but we actually think that we've struck a really good balance by making sure the lower level offending is not caught up. At the end of the day, it's the victims in our communities that need to have the security around them to know that we are taking this crime seriously.
With the second, in terms of the second strike with no parole and the third having the maximum sentence, have you received legal advice that that doesn't breach the Bill of Rights?
It's really important that we do get advice from the Attorney-General once the bill is produced, and I look forward to receiving that from her. But I do feel confident that we have addressed many of the issues with Bora, and that I hope that the Attorney-General will find that as well.
How confident are you though in that? Because that's a big that'll be a big interesting point as to whether or not that is going a bit too far, isn't it? Introducing sort of no parole period for the second strike and introducing automatic maximum sentences in that third strike.
Well,
How confident are you that you won't be breaching people's rights there?
Well, I think what has happened is that we've looked at what has happened in the past. There's been adjustments made, as Nicole's talked about. Gives us some confidence that we think we will be compliant with BORA and also with international human rights obligations. But that'll ultimately be a decision for the Attorney-General to see when legislation comes to the House. What I would just say to you is we are also here making sure that we're protecting the rights of New Zealanders to feel safe in their homes, their businesses and communities against violent offenders and violent sexual offenders. That is, I make no apologies about that. That's what we're going to do.
Finally from me, Prime Minister, what advice have you received, if any, that this will help to reduce crime?
Well, again, what we've seen is we know that actually we've got to be tough on crime. We know that we have to send a message very clearly. Well, we've seen different pieces of advice. There's been advice from previous examples of where, when we had it before, and likewise we've even seen examples from overseas jurisdictions like California.
Advice specifically say that this will lead to a reduction in crime?
The advice that I've seen is that over the last 5 years we've had over a 30% increase in serious violent crime in New Zealand. And the advice that we have taken on board is how to protect the victims in our communities and how do we go about restoring law and order. And that's getting serious, repetitive, recidivist, violent and sexual offenders off our streets and behind the bars.
I understand that, but just to be clear, you haven't seen any advice to suggest that this will in fact reduce crime?
Oh, we've seen bits of advice, as I said before, from California jurisdictions, other places, but I am telling you, the advice is the counterfactual, which is what happened in the last 6 years. Violent crime's gone up over 30%, year in, year out. Unacceptable. Got to stop.
Why not
Can you
Okay, sorry, going to go to Laura.
Can you explain how judicial discretion will be applied? Will judges have the discretion, in any case, or how limited is that?
So judges already have guiding principles on how they go about sentencing people, no matter what the crime is. We are also giving them guiding principles on how we expect the three strikes regime to work, what Parliament's intent is. But at the end of the day, the judges who make the decisions make those decisions on a case-by-case basis, and they need to bring all of those guiding principles that they've got to fore when they make those decisions. Whether or not it meets the three strikes regime is counter to that. That's in addition to whatever the sentence is that they propose.
So would the Fitzgerald case have made the threshold under this law?
I'm not prepared to speak about that case at the moment, Audrey, because it's currently still before the courts.
Prime Minister, National brought in the previous regime, Labour repealed it, you're bringing in a new revised version. Is this just becoming a bit of a political ping-pong ball? And does the judiciary need more certainty?
Well, that's what we're delivering here. As Nicole has talked about, we've made adjustments to the legislation. We think it's a good piece of legislation. As I said, it's very, very targeted on recidivist, repeat, serious offenders, serious sexual offenders, serious violent offenders. That is a good thing. I'm sorry, but I'm not making any apologies for being tough on serious criminals in this country. You cannot go around New Zealand causing hurt, harm, pain, suffering to individuals and families. And frankly, as I keep saying to you, if it even just saves one person from that trauma, that is a good thing, and I make no apologies for that.
Previous legislation was criticised as affecting Māori and Pacifica disproportionately, as well as people with physical and psychiatric disabilities. How sure are you that this is going to be new and improved and not have those issues again?
Well, exactly. That's the adjustments that Nicole's just talked you through with respect to those that may have mental health issues and putting provisions around that. I get that part of it. I'll just say to you with respect to Māori, Māori are overly represented as the victims of crime in New Zealand as well. And so this will benefit Māori because actually we're cutting down on the violent offenders that are causing them pain and suffering, whether they're Māori or non-Māori, frankly.
That may well be the case, but also the previous law was criticised for how it incarcerated Māori and Pacifica at a higher rate. So are you sure that this time around it's not going to have that effect?
Well, let's be really clear. Our goal here is to incarcerate violent offenders, violent sexual offenders. I don't care whether they're Māori or non-Māori. They're coming off our streets because they cause pain and suffering to regular New Zealanders. That is what it's all about here. That's as simple as it gets. And so, I appreciate what I know is that Māori are disproportionately impacted as victims of crime. If we can help them by actually making sure we take those offenders off the street, that's good news. Sorry, Luke.
So at its core, is this about reducing violent crime, or is this really about public safety?
This is about reducing violent crime and making sure that those that are causing pain and suffering to their fellow New Zealanders actually are taken off our streets. And as I said, we've got a process where I think Nicole's done an exceptionally good job of taking the learnings from the past legislation, making sure we've got the right checks and balances in place. But ultimately, as I said, if we take a handful of people off the street each and every year, I don't care how long, that's a good thing. Sorry?
Is this about really public safety, or is this, or is it reducing crime?
I think we will reduce crime because we'll have those serious, repetitive, recidivist offenders locked up, and as a result of that, we get public safety.
You had a chance to have a chat to David Seymour after his remarks last week?
Oh, look, I talk to political leaders and members of the Cabinet all the time. Talk to them all the time.
Do you regret saying that those comments were ill-considered on Friday? Did you air this laundry in public?
Look, no, I stand by my statements. What I just say to you is you'll be well aware of that the issue has actually kicked off in the High Court today, and you'll understand that I cannot comment any further about that.
Those comments breach the Cabinet menu?
Again, I stand by my statements. Again, the issue is now before the High Court. Proceedings have actually started today. It's inappropriate, and I just simply cannot comment.
Why didn't the Minister just provide a statement to the Waitangi Tribunal?
Sorry?
Why didn't the Minister just provide a statement to the
Again,
Waitangi Tribunal?
as you will understand, the issue is now before the High Court. Those proceedings have kicked off today. I just cannot comment any further around that case.
David, when you did speak to David Seymour, about those comments. Did he tell you off?
Sorry?
When you did speak to David Seymour following the ill-considered comments, you labelling his comments as ill-considered, he then said to staff that you should raise your concerns with him rather than through the media. When you did speak to him, did he bring that up, or did he tell you off?
We have deep and meaningful conversations on a range of topics with all the political leaders in the coalition, but also other ministers within the coalition. I'm not going into the detail of the conversations.
Was David Seymour really upset about that?
I think I'm going to leave this one for the leaders to deal with.
Taiwan's foreign minister has given an interview with Sam Sachdeva to say he's interested in increasing trade with New Zealand. Is that of interest to New Zealand? Would you consider upgrading the 2013 agreement with Taiwan?
Well, as you know, we've just done a swing through Southeast Asia. We know that we want to double our exports all across the world. In New Zealand, that's important over the next 10 years. We're interested in doing business with many nations across the world. And so, again, we'll look into that. But again, the opportunities for us have been fixated on Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, and then ultimately India and China.
Are you able to say specifically whether that includes Taiwan?
Yes. We already have a free trade agreement with Taiwan.
A coalition of MPs visited last week. Would you allow ministers to visit Taiwan, or would you consider yourself personally visiting?
Well, we have a long-standing policy of a one China policy, which it was important that we continue to uphold. And in that context, that is not something that I would be doing.
And your ministers, are your ministers, would your trade minister make a visit?
Again, I'm not going to get into that. What I just say to you is that we're interested in expanding trade across the world. We want to double our exports. We'll look at trade opportunities anywhere and everywhere.
Just back on three strikes, the early guilty plea, what would that limited benefit look like? Do you have an idea?
Yes, for those that are having their third strike being heard in the courts, if they do plead guilty at third strike, they'll be eligible for a 20% reduction maximum in their sentencing. We think that this is important essentially for victims, because if a person does plead guilty, it means a victim is not re-traumatised, having to relive that drama in the courtroom. So we have introduced a maximum 20% penalty, 20% reduction in possible sentencing at third strike.
$11 million for between 45 and 90 people each year. You're happy with that cost? You think it's worth it?
Yeah, because I think about the pain and suffering that's caused by those violent offenders and the trauma that causes those families and those victims, that is a good investment.
Minister, you've publicly chastised David Seymour and Shane Jones. You have Seymour's now called you out publicly, and Winston Peters is delaying your media plans on purpose. How cracked is your coalition?
Sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about with that question. What are you referencing?
Just so you've got all these issues playing out publicly.
Which issues?
You've got David Seymour saying he's going to speak to you about this, that you shouldn't go to the media. You've called out Shane Jones, asking how cracked is your coalition?
Our coalition is incredibly in good shape, and you can see a coalition that is very focused on rebuilding the economy, restoring law and order, delivering better health and education. We're making tremendous progress. It's been good to see inflation hit 4% just in the last week. We're taking a lot of actions to rebuild the economy. As I said, we're here today talking about restoring law and order and delivering better health and public services. So I'm very proud of our coalition. We are working incredibly well together. We're very united on the core things. We've got a good work program, as you've seen, right from day one. We've done it differently from previous coalition arrangements. The fact that we have a clear work plan, clear agenda, is giving our government huge focus and huge clarity about what we're driving forward and doing. So, no, I'm very, very proud of it. I'm very proud of the contribution of those two individuals as well.
Just back on that bill, what is the time? What's the timeline on the bill, please?
Yep.
So I'll be taking the bill itself into Cabinet in next month, during June, and I hope to have it introduced before the end of the quarter.
Prime Minister, just to clarify on the answer you gave me before about the previous three strikes law disproportionately affecting Māori and Pacifica, and you're saying, well, it doesn't really matter if Māori and Pacifica are committing those crimes and getting incarcerated through the three strikes law. Are you basically saying to Māori and Pacifica just to commit fewer serious crimes? Is that
No.
the government?
I'm calling all New Zealanders, irrespective of your ethnicity, to hold up to something called rights and responsibilities. And when you are a serious, just remember what this three strikes legislation is about. It's about targeting serious, recidivist, violent criminals, serious, recidivist, violent sexual offenders. That is causing huge pain and suffering to families. And I just encourage you, go sit down with some victims of those crimes. Go talk to them. Go talk to them and actually put yourself in their shoes about what it's been like. So I make no apologies for putting in place this legislation because I think it's really important. And as I said to you, having sat down and spoken to people who've been impacted by this, you just have to think about just even if it saves one case of that pain and suffering and go through the detail with them of how they've felt. I'm on the side of victims, and I'm saying to New Zealanders, irrespective of whether you're Māori, Pasifika, non-Māori, whatever, I don't care. We're holding ourselves all to the same standard, which is that you don't get to go around causing that level of pain and suffering on your fellow New Zealanders. Unacceptable. Utterly, utterly unacceptable.
However, Minister, can you just reiterate, though, even though the Prime Minister has just said that, you had said previously that there are safeguards now for those lower level offenders.
Correct. Yep.
We actually got picked up at that lower level end, Māori and Pasifika, in that previous data. But can you just reiterate for us again that there are safety measures
Correct. That's
that
what we've
will
changed.
not capture our Māori and Pasifika who were captured in that last 3 strikes?
In the revised and what I think is an improved 3 strikes regime, lower level offending, those where sentences are 24 months or less, will not be captured in the 3 strikes regime. And to be quite frank, whether it's Māori, Pasifika or anybody else, it's taking away the criminal activity from all New Zealanders that has been committed by all New Zealanders, regardless of their ethnicity.
But that is where we were, though. That is where the data does show we were picked up at that lower level. So although it is for all New Zealanders, absolutely, we can gather an amount of confidence that Māori will not be picked up at that lower level end.
Well, again, what I'd say, whether it's Māori or non-Māori, what we're saying is the problem with the last piece of legislation was it often caught up less serious crimes. And what we're saying is that's why the adjustment's been made and the limit's been put in around 24 months. Likewise, there's also been some flexibility available for certain cases around mental health or whatever it may need to be. But remembering at the end of the day what we're trying to do here, we're talking about serious, serious criminal offenders who are causing so much hurt, pain and suffering to fellow New Zealanders. That has to stop. It has to stop. And so, frankly, we make no apologies about this legislation. We're proud of this legislation because if that means New Zealanders get to feel safer in their own homes, businesses, communities, that's exactly what our primary job of a government should be about.
The customs are finding out if their jobs are likely to be cut today. How confident are you that these cuts are continuing to avoid the front line, particularly given today's announcement? Obviously, customs has a role to play in enforcing the border, enforcing drug trafficking, etc. That's a tough on crime measure that you could be taking, and yet you are taking money out of enforcing those laws.
Yeah, look, the first thing I'd say is, I just acknowledge how difficult it is. Any job layoffs, whether they're in the public sector here in Wellington or whether they're in the private sector across many businesses across New Zealand, even over the last 6 years. It's been an incredibly tough time, and it is tough for those individuals that are impacted by those decisions. But as you know, we were a government that was elected to actually get this economy sorted and to get things moving. And for that, for us, that means ending the wasteful spending and moving the money from the back office to the front line.
You have made a guarantee that there wouldn't be frontline cuts, and some of the announcements we've had over the last few weeks have come quite close and possibly stepped over the line into being a frontline cut. You've had stuff like the fire enforcement stuff at MB, conservation officers, customs looks like it's actually going to...
I'll just say to you, look, let's be clear about what's happened. We had a government before that increased government spending by 84%. It hired 16,000 more public servants, and our results and outcomes got worse. And so New Zealanders know that spending, that delivery, has not delivered for New Zealanders. And so it's been a massive increase in spending that then has driven up inflation, that's driven up interest rates, that's slowed our economy down, that has led to layoffs in the private sector and now ultimately the public sector. So we know that that's the reality of when you don't manage an economy well, that's the consequence of not getting on top of inflation. Something that we all spoke about 2 years ago, if you remember. So what I just say to you very clearly is that we have tasked the CEOs of the government agencies to generate savings. Many of them are getting rid of vacant roles that exist. Yes, there are some real impacts for real people and real jobs, which is being felt, but also there is programs that are being stopped, and we have said very clearly, these are the goals. How you deliver those goals and organise your resources to deliver those outcomes is what New Zealanders care about. That's what we want you to do.
The jobs going at customs, there's 79 of them across ports and airports around the country. Is that not the front line?
Again, those are decisions for the head of the government agency to make. They are best placed.
The front line won't be
Sure,
affected
but
through
what
the
we've
job
promised is to make sure that we actually get better outcomes is what this is about. And you can get better outcomes with the same amount of money, even less amount of money, if you actually organise to focus on the things that are important. Those decisions are left.
Frontline workers doesn't matter if the money's
Sorry?
The promise to not cut frontline workers, that doesn't
Frontline
matter.
services, we have said all along we want to prioritise and protect frontline services. That's what matters, because those are the things that matter to New Zealanders dealing with their government. That's why we've set the 9 targets, to make sure everyone's very clear about what we're striving for. Then how those targets are best delivered is up to those CEOs and those ministers to make sure that they organise those agencies to deliver and improve those outcomes.
Sorry? You're not concerned that those frontline services will be eroded with the reduction in frontline staffing numbers?
Well, I just say to you, we've had a 16,000 people increase in the public service, and we have had worse outcomes. Wait times for hospital services. Think about crime statistics going the wrong way. Think about our educational outcomes, despite all the extra public service that have gone into that. So it's not about people and dollars. The quantum matters, don't get me wrong, but it's actually what you do with the people, what you do with the resources, what you do with your priorities, how you better prioritise that gets those outcomes.
Yeah,
Who will essentially run the ruler over the decisions made by the CEOs about where to cut? Is it the ministers, or at what point does someone run the ruler over their decisions and kind of check whether those are the appropriate places in which to make those savings? Is anyone going to be doing that? Is there going to be a
Well, the first protocol
kind of
is that the goal that we have set the CEOs of the government agencies is to generate the dollar savings. How they deliver those through a combination of stopping bad projects that aren't delivering, projects with poor returns, getting rid of the wasteful spending, extra layers of management that aren't adding any value. All of that is left up for them to deliver that outcome. Ministers will oversee it. Obviously, we go through a budget process and Cabinet signs off on it.
Can you spell out your government's issue with Section 7AA of the Oranga Tamariki Act?
Look, very simply, we want to prioritise the health of a child, of our most vulnerable children. That is job number one. That is without doubt the thing that we must focus everyone's attention on. We want our children, who are our most vulnerable, to be in the most loving homes they possibly can, to be cared for, to be loved for, to be looked after. That is a huge responsibility of the state for our most vulnerable kids. And so we want to send a message very clearly. That is the number one job. There is nothing else more important than that task.
Could the Minister of Children not have simply written that down as an evidence form and sent that into the Waitangi Tribunal, like you just did then?
Sorry?
Could the Minister of Children not have simply written
well,
that down
again,
in evidence form?
I'm a bit hamstrung today because, as you know, those proceedings have kicked off in the High Court. But I'm just telling you the rationale for why we are very strong about that, and that has been something that actually all 3 parties have felt before the election. As a coalition government, it's very important to us. We have a massive challenge, as you know, in Oranga Tamariki. We need to make sure that organisation is working and doing everything it possibly can to protect our most vulnerable kids. We feel that responsibility very keenly, and we want to make sure that there is nothing, there is no ambiguity about that this is the most important priority thing. I think our position is well understood for why we want to make that change.
What will you be saying to those iwi and hapu groups who are already working with Oranga Tamariki, who have the devolved services to them, who are actually looking, identifying the tamariki who whakapapa to their area, like Maniapoto, Ngāpuhi, Tūhoi? That is exactly what they do. They identify and they take their tamariki, that whakapapa, to them. Now, that is a part, an extension of 7AA. Will you be requiring
all we
them
care
to
about
stop
is that all we care about is our young kids who are the most vulnerable.
It's an extension of 7AA.
But just listen, what I'd say to you is all we care about is that our kids end up in really loving and caring homes. Period.
What will you do about that specifically?
What follows after that drive is secondary. What matters primarily is that our kids end up in good places.
Prime Minister, Thursday is your first Anzac Day as Prime Minister. How will you be observing the day? Do you have a message? And do you have any sort of familial links to Anzac deployments? Yeah, look, I've been celebrating Anzac Day for many, many years, and my routine is I'll go to the Auckland Cenotaph at the Domain, and my son usually comes along with me typically, and so I'm looking forward to doing that with him. And then we have a formal set of a ceremony, obviously the Dawn Parade there,
and then I tend to go out to Botany and hang out with veterans at the RSA at the pub. So that's always a good chance to catch up with them as well. Our veterans, we owe so much to. They do so much great public service. They step up for New Zealand, past, present and future, and they do an incredibly good job, and I'm incredibly proud of them. And so for me to be able to recognise that as a special. In my own personal case, my great-grandfather was in World War I at the time, and one of the big battles where the first tanks appeared, and I've got a lot of his letters back home at that time. And, these were incredible young people, and they fought for New Zealand and stood up for our values all around the world. And we get to, live the life that we have here in relative freedom and our liberal democracy because of the sacrifices that have gone before us. So I think Anzac Day is a very special day for us all to be able to celebrate, recognise and remember, what these people stand up for us for and what they fight for.
Forgive my ignorance. Did Tuup make it to this side of the Tasman? Is that an Anzac tradition? You play that?
No, it tends to be more an Australian concoction. But we, yes, no, I know what you mean. Yes, no, the Australian Tuup is a big deal. Yep.
Was there a cabinet meeting?
Sorry?
Was there a cabinet meeting?
No, we have what is a Cabinet Business Committee meeting today, which we'll be handling virtually.
Gisborne, Timaru and Invercargill are losing their daily customs presence. Now,
Sorry?
Whangarei, Gisborne, Timaru and Invercargill ports are losing a daily customs presence as part of these cuts. Those regions have well-known drug problems in terms of drugs being imported. Is there not a case to be made for maintaining those 4 stars just to ensure drugs don't get
Well, again, what matters is that the agencies in charge of customs and the CEOs in charge of customs will make sure that they've organised themselves. There might be lots of different alternatives to deliver those outcomes of actually making sure that they keep drugs out of this country. They're best placed to make those decisions. They understand the outcomes that we're expecting to hold them accountable for, but just assuming that the maintenance of those roles solves that problem when there might be lots of other ways to deal with that is something I wouldn't want to get into.
You campaigned on a sort of boots-on-the-ground strategy for combating crime. These roles are intended to combat, a very serious crime, which is importing dangerous drugs into the country.
Again, I just say to you, we're focused on the results of reducing drug importation into New Zealand. How Customs chooses to organise to deal with that challenge, with all the resources they have, with the very large budgets that they have, is ultimately up to them.
Prime Minister, I'm more of a rugby league guy, but I know you're a Satyrs fan. Do you have any advice for them and with them in the state that they are at the moment?
Yeah, look, keep the faith. It's not over till it's over. Yes, it's been a disappointing run so far, but we're just warming up. Trust us, we'll get there to the playoffs. We'll win nice or we win ugly, but we win, as the story of the Crusaders, and that will continue, I'm sure.
Do they need to be more outcomes driven?
Don't you worry, they're going to get there. They'll be focused on delivery and results.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.